Hi guys, Matt Easton here. So I'm here with Paul Mortimer. We're looking at the Anglo-Saxon, specifically Sutton Hoo finds, and Paul is one of the leading experts on Sutton Hoo and the period, particularly of Anglo-Saxon material culture and also religion and everything else. And we're looking here at the Sutton Hoo Sword. Now, any of you who've been to the British Museum in London will probably have seen the recreation of the Sutton Hoo helmet, shield and sword, and the originals side by side. This is somewhat different, I think, to the recreation that's in the British Museum, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So first up, well, shall I give you a close-up look? There we go. We have an incredibly elaborate sword. We'll just look at the hilts. I'll show you the blade in a little moment. So here we've got horn, grip and guard and pommel plates, and essentially gilded or solid?
No, it's solid gold.
Solid gold. I'll hold it carefully. Solid gold pommel and other parts on the hilt here, including a decorative plate at top and bottom, which is quite an unusual feature on the horn grip. First up is what this sword is pretty special, isn't it? Within the context of migration era swords, this is pretty much one of the most elaborate ones that we know of.
Yeah, it's not bad. There are other swords with more elaborate blades than this. In fact, the blade in some regards is pretty ordinary. But the gold and garnet decoration on both the handle and on the suspension arrangements and on the belt are magnificent. There's nothing like those anywhere else.
Because of course there's the buckle and there's everything else which goes with it. So you don't just think about a sword, obviously it's a unit. It's a sword, a scabbard, the thing that connects the scabbards to the belt, and then there's the whole belt garniture as well. It's a lot of gold and a lot of garnet. Garnet is a red, is it stone? It's a kind of crystal, isn't it? Yeah. And it comes from, I think garnet comes more from Central Europe, doesn't it?
Well, they occur all over the place, but the thinking at the moment is that the garnets from swords like this and Staffordshire Hoard probably came from either the Czech Republic, what's now the Czech Republic, and even possibly as far afield as Sri Lanka.
Wow. Okay, so garnet is perhaps demonstrate, I mean, apart from the appearance of it, which might show the choice of this red and gold, which is quite, we see it a lot in the Staffordshire Hoard, don't we? So
we do, yeah.
It's possible that the combination of the red and gold meant something to them, but it's also showing on a base level, I suppose, the fact that they're part of a trade network that can draw materials from all over the world, potentially. As I understand it, in the Staffordshire Hoard they've analysed some of the gold as well and found that some of the gold comes from quite far afield.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I don't know.
But anyway, so we've got solid, and also
they found that some of the gold wasn't quite as pure as they thought it was.
Oh right, okay.
The goldsmiths were pretty adept at actually making the most of the gold buried with other metals.
Yeah. So creating, making as much of the gold as they possibly could. And I think I'm correct in saying that certainly the pommel cap is quite similar in style to some of the Staffordshire Hoard.
Yeah.
So whether they're similar in date or whether there was a style that covered quite a period of time.
I think they are pretty similar in dates, all around about the 6th and 7th centuries.
And the Staffordshire Hoard, for those of you who don't know, was relatively recent. It was 2 or 3 years? 2009. And there are a huge quantity of parts that have presumably been taken off.
War gear.
Been taken off swords and saxes and bits of helmet possibly and shield and
over
such.
4,000 now apparently.
4,000 pieces.
And something like 92 sword pommels.
Yeah,
some of them may be CX pommels.
Yeah, so I mean that's mind-blowing when you think about it. You think about something that's essentially like crown jewels quality, but then you think that the Staffordshire Hoard has over 90, representative of perhaps over 90 swords in there. So it seems like these swords maybe weren't as rare as we used to think that they were.
Yeah, I think not exactly common perhaps, but there were quite a lot of swords around in the period.
Yeah, and when you consider the population was fairly small at that point, million, 2 million people.
Perhaps
So-
a million, I suppose. I don't
Yeah,
know. There's been lots
so-
of estimates.
So actually that's a lot of swords of this kind of, but that shouldn't diminish what we've got with the Sutton Hoo Sword, which is very, very special, and of course it's complete. We've got a complete sword, whereas Staffordshire Horde is lots of pieces and they don't all go together, and some of them are only partial, and I think a lot of them have been broken off as
They
well.
have, been ripped off of things.
Yeah. So what have we got? Essentially this type of migration era hilt. We just move a bit closer to the camera maybe so you can see the hilt a bit better. So it's composed essentially of a pommel end cap, which it should be mentioned is not really a counterbalance, is it? I mean, it doesn't
No.
weigh very much, so it's not like a later medieval pommel or a Renaissance pommel. It's not really counterbalancing very much at all. So we've got a metal end cap which is riveted through a horn. What's that called? A pommel
That's the upper
plate,
guard.
upper guard, and then there's a metal plate underneath. So essentially it's a sandwich with metal either side and organic material, usually horn, in the middle. Although I think these are sometimes in some they can be wood, can't they? Or
They
other
can
things.
be bone, ivory,
All sorts of
yeah,
things
wood.
in the middle. So a sandwich of metal either side of that, and then we've got a grip that's made up of sections, alternating in this case of light horn and dark horn.
Yeah, but that we know the handle was made of horn, but we don't know that it had alternating patterns.
Okay, but it
That's
certainly looks good.
speculative. Yeah, it does.
and it may well have, that seems, and the basic shape of these grips reminds me of Roman gladius and Sparta grips in the fact that it's got these 4 recesses for the fingers. That's quite,
But that is speculative.
it is speculative, but they do look a bit similar, at least superficially. We don't know if it comes from the Roman Sparta, but it certainly has a passing resemblance in terms of the grip. Although it should be mentioned, I think that Roman grips are almost always, or certainly usually, made of bone and occasionally made of wood. I don't think that they use horn. I know there's one of ivory, but usually they're bone. So that's a difference between the Roman grips and these. And then we've got a similar construction for the guard, although whether we'd call that a guard, because I'm not sure whether it's really guarding the hand. It's very short, as you'll see, to the pommel. So it's a sandwich of metal either side of horn. What kind of horn is this?
Cattle horn.
Okay, it's a cow horn. Yeah. Okay. Right. So, and then what are these knobs on the
Wow.
scabbard there? So they're gold and garnet again.
These bosses are almost certainly part of the suspension arrangement, and that's how I've rigged them up. The pyramids weren't. It doesn't appear. They would have. They certainly were attached to some form of strap, and here they're going through a woolen tablet weave. And I've used them in the form of a sword knot, and they could be piece bands, so they could actually be untied and shown that the person who's carrying the sword is at peace and not going to draw the sword. But that's speculative. We don't really know.
I think in later, in sort of Viking era sources, there are mentions of words that might imply that swords were sometimes tied into their scabbards. But again, even in that period, that's speculative, isn't it? Because the words, the vocabulary is sort of it's up for debate. So these are made of gold with
Gold and garnet.
Are they solid
and a bit
gold?
of glass. The originals were. These are slightly less solid.
Right, okay, but still, there's a lot of gold on this sword, and the underlying bits are made of. Is that bone?
That's antler.
Oh, it's antler. Okay.
The originals were backed with some organic material. It was white, but we don't know exactly whether it was bone or antler or ivory even.
Okay.
But I've used antler.
And the scabbard is wood with leather over the top.
Leather over the top, but it's lined with beaver fur.
Beaver fur, okay. And do we know it was beaver fur?
Well, it not for certain, but the configuration of the hairs led the archaeologist who studied it to think it probably was beaver, because they lie diagonally to the grain of the flesh.
Oh, right, okay.
So we've used beaver, and that may be because beaver fur is relatively waterproof.
Right, okay. So should we have a look at the blade then? So shall I? There we go. So I don't know how well you guys will be able to see this in this light. There we go. You can see that nicely. Look at that pattern welding. So tell me about it.
Well, it's made up of 2 different pieces really. The centre is 4 rods of laminated metals, and the edge is made of steel, which has been folded a few times. It has a slightly different pattern on the other side if you turn it over. So it's a two-layered sword, as the original was. When we went to the British Museum, they were very kind to get the original out of the case for us. We think there's no evidence for a fuller. It's always been assumed there was one before, but we could find no evidence for a fuller at all. But it is rather flat on top. It's not actually a terribly lenticular blade. It's not curved.
So I mean that's a fairly major difference between this recreation and the British Museum one. That has a fuller and this one doesn't. I think I'm right in saying that actually quite a lot of these sort of earlier period migration era swords don't have fullers.
They don't appear to be. Fullers seem to be quite rare.
And I know that, you know, not saying that it's necessarily related to the Roman Sparta, but a lot of Roman Spartas don't have fullers.
No, they don't. It's true.
So in some senses the fuller could be seen as a slightly later development.
There are fullers from our period, from the 5th to 7th century, but it's quite possible that sometimes they go unrecognised because swords are usually buried in their scabbards, and but most of the ones that have been X-rayed don't appear to show a fuller.
And so if we just pan out the bit so you can see a bit more of the length. So this is to what I'm used to and to my handling. First of all, the hilt in the hand doesn't feel very different to the Viking era hilt. It's similar length, similar shape, similar kind of thing really. But this is a very blade. It's got a lot of blade presence. The point of balance. I don't like touching blades, but the point of balance is about 12 inches.
Probably.
Yeah, it's a long way up the blade. It's not a particularly long blade. It's what, about 28 inches?
It's under average for an Anglo-Saxon sword of this period. It's about probably about 4 centimetres shorter than the average, maybe 6.
But it's broader than the average.
It's pretty broad, yeah.
Yeah. So it's a very broad and a little bit shorter blade. So it's maybe the same amount of material, but in a slightly different format. And this is it's a chopper. There's no way around. There's no way around it. It does certainly have a point of balance, which is far from the hand. But you know, in the context of using a large shield, maybe that makes a lot of sense. I don't know. It's. I mean, we were talking earlier about what people describe as balanced or unbalanced swords, and it's really a silly way to describe a sword because swords are used in completely different ways in completely different contexts. And if you compare it to something like an axe, this is still better balanced than an axe, and clearly we know that axes were very successfully used in fighting, particularly with shields. So it's, compared to something like a typical later medieval sword, it feels unbalanced, but it's still better balanced than an axe or a mace. So it is a big chopper though. That is a big blade and it's going to do a lot of damage when it hits things. Not nimble with the point. That's not to say it couldn't thrust. Of course you can thrust with an axe and you can thrust with a mace. But it certainly feels like it's set up to deal big blows with the sword. Just a little detail. So Paul and I were talking about, if you can just see there's some little gold decorations, and this is quite an unusual feature I think. And it's at the top and bottom of only one side of the grip. Maybe that was as a sort of a reminder of which edge was which in the hand.
I think so. Yeah.
So which was the front edge, which was the back edge?
There are other swords that have 4 or even gold collars that go all the way around, but this one only has those, and I think it is about direction and knowing, indicating where his favourite side is.
Yeah. And the other thing to note about swords of this period is they very often have, as this does, the rivets come through and stand proud on the inner side of the upper and lower guards. And I have to say, looking at pictures of this type of sword, I thought that would be more uncomfortable in the hand, but actually it doesn't seem to actually touch the hand really.
No, it fits very well.
Yeah, I mean certainly on the index finger seems to not go that far out as the rivet, and as far as the pommel's concerned, I find that the pommel comes on the inside of the hand anyway, so it doesn't seem to be a problem. And there are, I know some other swords, this rivet actually stands much bigger and much more proud.
Yeah. So. They tend to be rounded though when they're more proud of the guard.
Yeah, which I guess being larger and more rounded would mean that they'd be less offensive to your hand anyway.
One interesting feature of the pommel is that the pattern on the front tends to be different to the pattern on the back. And with this, it's actually very subtle. If you look at the top cells, you'll see that on one side there's two, but on the other side there's one. But there are other differences, and that's a feature of swords of this period. Almost all of them.
You look at
are
the
different.
middle piece there. We turn it around, and it doesn't have it on that side, so it's different on each side.
We have no idea why that is, but that seems to be generally the case. There are a couple that are identical, but very few.
So there we go, guys. That's the Sutton Hoo Sword, and it is a very interesting beast in hand. I'll reiterate, it's not hugely different to a Viking era sword to me, but certainly this example has a lot of blade presence, which I'm sure some Viking era swords did as well. But it's an interesting sword, and it's not, the differences in the hilt don't equate to me to as much difference in the hand as I thought it would have compared to a Viking era hilt. In the hand, it actually feels remarkably similar to Anglo-Saxon, Frankish, Viking era hilts. So yeah, an interesting thing. I think one of the big differences is the ribbed grip, and this is quite different to later sort of so-called Dark Age hilts. So, thank you very much, Paul.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Click subscribe now and also follow us on Facebook.